My name is Linda McLeod, as introduced. I represent a very aspirational organization called the Namibia Investment Promotion and Development Board. And today my theme is Building Namibia, a future fit nation, the Namibia we want. And I think you've just displayed it, so thank you so much, Vanessa. So, a future fit nation, I'll start off with a quote by Leonard Sweet that says, "The future is not something we enter. The future is something we create." And in that essence, usually what we do at NIPDB is we tell the world about Namibia. But I think sometimes it's important to remind Namibians about where they are, where they're coming from, and where we are headed. And that's why I'm going to delve a little bit, maybe bore you, but I think it's just a reminder of what we can do together. I think this whole morning we have been experiencing a mind-blowing experience of all the technology that's happening in the world. And sometimes when we speak to each other, especially in the innovation ecosystem, we refer to the future as very far and something that is distant, especially when we talk about fourth IR and the fifth IR. I want to remind ourselves that Namibia is really doing very well amongst the peers. And hence, I'm going to delve a little bit into something that might bore Namibians, but just to remind us who we are and that we can stand tall in this Africa and globally. So first of all, as a nation, we have the first in Africa rule of law, and politically we are also very stable in the country. To little bit go to the far right, you'll see 8th in Africa in the startup ecosystem ranking. Currently we are ranked as 85 globally, and we are ranked 8th in Africa and 2nd in Southern Africa. So in the startup ecosystem, it's very important that we keep our rankings almost more or less in touch with what's going on with our peers in SADC as well as in Africa. In the Southern Africa, we all know that South Africa is the big brother of the startup ecosystem. The rest of Africa is then driven by Nigeria, Egypt, as well as Kenya. So we are constantly competing, and that's where my hat lies most of the time, is running and orchestrating the startup ecosystem of Namibia. So that's why it's very important to have an eye on what is happening competitively in Africa as well as around the world. 92% literacy rate, second best in Africa, and obviously second run in Southern Africa tourist arrivals of 2021. Also very important, and I just quickly want to look for it. I'm looking for the one that basically, I think it's the next slide. So basically it also just speaks about where we are currently as leadership and the role of that gender gap. And we can proudly say that that gender gap in Namibia, we are ranked 8th in Africa. I can't see it currently right now, but also best in Africa and 8th globally, correctly speaking. So that evidently comes with where we are as the top 3 leadership. Our Excellency, her President, the Vice President, as well as the Speaker of the House. So that basically is something to be proud of, and just to remind us as Namibians that that gender gap that is sometimes basically yearned for in other African countries comes very spontaneously to us in Namibia. And if we look at the room, yes, in the IT sector, it is male-driven, but we can also see amongst us there's a handful of females in the room. And Vanessa just proved that females are spearheading the 4th industrial revolution. So government initiatives from Namibia, just to also make sure that we are digitally competitive, and I think we need to update this slide, is the CERT that we just heard about and learned from CRAN. So there is a communications regulatory authority in Namibia. We saw that, and evidently they're doing very well. We have our national ICT policy. We also have the national digital strategy, as well as the Namibian broadband policy in country. So as a country, we're always known for policy being in place, but something that we do lack is the implementation of that. And we need to actively start amending that and making sure that we actively implement and work with the ecosystem to make sure that both public-private sector comes together to make sure that these policies are actually implementable and that they are co-created together under one umbrella. I think I'll skip this one a little bit. I think it's been covered a little bit across the maybe during the day, but maybe something that's important is the UCD average cost per 1 gigabyte is $10.52. If you Google that, I think that's a little bit high in comparison to other African countries. So I think this also speaks to a slide that will come earlier, is that digital divide, especially in the rural and urban areas. It is quite expensive, and if we want to spearhead innovation in technology, it starts with those basic infrastructural needs that everybody needs to actually benefit from, not just in the urban areas, but also in the rural areas. It needs to be affordable. Internet is not a privilege, it's becoming a necessity. Our underutilized value proposition. So in the startup ecosystem, we speak about the UVP. I think in Namibia as a country, we should also start appreciating what is our UVP. Usually, unique value proposition. That's what it stands for. But I think for us as a country, it's basically underutilized value proposition. Namibia is very logistically well positioned. We have the best road infrastructure in the country. We have a very, that's the right word, uncongested ports. And we proudly say this as uncongested ports, but that means it's an underutilized opportunity. And these are just opportunities that we have not even tapped into, and yet we are aspiring to technology and innovation and all of these things. But these are our infrastructural support that we already have in the country and that we're not making use of. So just a reminder as to, as a logistics hub, how can we fully fledged using technology to basically make this a unique value proposition and not an underutilized value proposition. The country is forever known now as a land of emerging sectors. One is the green hydrogen. Earlier I heard that energy is something that's very important. I saw in one of the booths that without data, there is no AI. But I think without energy, there's nothing, right? So I think energy is very important, and I think Namibia is really sitting on a gold mine of two opportunities. One, yes, the green hydrogen. Some might speculate its possibilities and also the potential of what it can bring for the country. But one that's come up recently is our nuclear plant that's being speculated about, and the uranium that we strongly have in the country. If that is fully explored, and that is our anchor, what can Namibia not just become? Housing data centers and maybe many more. So that's just also another unutilized value proposition. And sometimes we try to diversify and speculate with too many opportunities in the country, but maybe we need to start specializing with what we have so that we can make sure we can play competitively and utilize the value chain opportunities that we have in our country that is naturally born to us. The current realities on the ground, as mentioned before, is the digital divide between what we have in country, especially in Windhoek. I operate in the startup sector a lot, and what we see is that startup sector is only alive in Windhoek. But when you start moving outside of Windhoek, it starts lacking. The terminology is different. You still see the traditional MSME model taking place across the country more. So I think you want to make sure that when you start speaking about the startup ecosystem, you also want to make sure that all of those resources that are in Windhoek are also somewhere else in the country, whether in the north, the south, the east, or the west of the country. And it is intentional for us to start seeing that once that special economic zone bill comes out and it's being applied, it should be applied in such a way that it is uniquely going to complement the natural resources of, let's say, a specific region. If it's agriculture, let that region focus on agriculture and let agri-tech then take over that sector. Another one is our under-leveraged innovation capacity in the country. There is no lack of innovation in Namibia. I think it's just another under-leveraged possibility and opportunity that we have not explored. Currently, in the startup ecosystem, we see that we have so many hubs, what we call innovation hubs, and most of them operate virtually. Because of that operational cost to actually maintain either the rent, either to keep the talent that basically makes sure that they birth the innovators, the entrepreneurs, the startups, and they carry those burdens. And most of them basically carry that burden through donor funder. And there's also not a risk appetite in the country to basically support startups to carry from incubation all the way to acceleration and become an investable product. So what we call in the startup ecosystem is a valley of death. All of these nice ideas come to life in ideation stage. They don't have anywhere to go to pilot, to prototype, because it's too expensive. And then what happens is they fall into this valley of death, and it becomes very, very, very sad to see all of that innovation and creativity never taking flight to become investor ready, because there is no support to take them through that value chain all the way from incubation to become an accelerator, or to go into that accelerator stage and growth and actually become an employer. So it is actually our responsibility all in the room to make sure that the infrastructure, the ecosystem is enabling enough for innovation to go all the way through to that place where it becomes an employer of the economy. Another one is the limited startup funding. I think I've touched on that. And then there's a skills mismatch. And what we mean with that is that we had a conversation the other day, and we speak about the simple economy. We do not take our products and diversify that value chain and say that, okay, we have tomatoes. How do we make tomato paste? So let's take a graduate. We say we don't have jobs for them. It's because there's a mismatch between these engineers and what is actually readily available in the market to absorb them. So it's not that we don't have the graduates, it's not that we don't have the skills, it's that there's no market to absorb them because we simply do not diversify our value chains to such a point that we actually appreciate the quantity surveyor, that we actually appreciate that engineer that has gone into AI. But where do they get a job? So they go into the most simplistic things of just becoming another employee, and they just take a job, whatever comes their way. So it's not we don't have the talent, is that there's a mismatch between the market and the graduates that we're giving birth to. Another one is the slow adoption of emerging technologies. And this maybe is more from a perspective from the public sector. And that is the current realities on the ground. And my focus today is where we are today as Namibia and where we are aspiring towards, and how we can use the Agenda 2063, which is a bold blueprint for the continent's future. As Namibians, we must remain focused and committed to pulling force towards that Agenda 2063. Yes, we have our Vision 2030, but what happens after that? Are we planning for that? Where are we headed as a country? So that's very important to keep ourselves accountable. And if we do have these national plans, what is the monitoring and evaluation? How do we keep ourselves accountable? Another one is the future will be shaped by how we invest in our people today, our leadership, and the technology. The world is changing fast as Namibia. We must continue being resilient, embrace agility, and opportunity-driven in accordance to our own UVP. Also, if not now, then when? Entrepreneurship is the key, I believe. Thank you. So Namibia, the Namibian entrepreneurship ecosystem, we work together with the World Bank as well as Brighter Bridges on an ecosystem diagnostic report, just to see more or less where's the pulse of the Namibian entrepreneurship ecosystem. So what we tried to achieve was mapping of the Namibian entrepreneurship ecosystem. What that basically means is we took the innovation hubs, we took the entrepreneurial support organizations, and we saw what services do they give at what stage, and if there are gaps, how do we fill them? We also did a data-backed analysis of the current state and potential of the ecosystem, comparative assessment against regional benchmarks, and identification of strategic priorities for ecosystem advancement. So the findings were very interesting. The first observation was the entrepreneurship landscape itself, is that data shows that there's a diverse growing ecosystem in Namibia. So there is no lack of entrepreneurship, there is no lack of innovation. The question is just, is it all directed to a purpose? Or are we all just doing something to tick a box and also just to survive? So what we see in the ecosystem is entrepreneurial support organizations are competing for the same bag of money as the entrepreneurs. There is no diverse vehicles to support all of them in the ecosystem. So we tend to see that these entrepreneurial support organizations work with the traditional vehicles, which is usually your commercial banks, And then for the startups themselves, there is no risk appetite to give them financing themselves directly. So they give the money to the entrepreneurial support organizations to give it then through their programs. But what we've realized is in these programs is that it's almost taking your entrepreneurs to grade 1 all over again through different innovation hubs. So let's take, for instance, myself. I'm a startup A. I go to hub number 1. And I do a program for 6 months. That program, let's say, call it's grade 1. I go to a next innovation hub, and it's because they just got funding from the same bag. They do not diversify their services to say that now we tailor a program that is more to grade 2. They put me back in grade 1. And what we see is that you will see that there's a gap between what LEFA needs and what an ideation stage type of startup needs. What LEFA needs is more operational costs. They need money to basically keep their accounting, their books, their operationalizations of day-to-day things in order. But there is no money to carry them, and there's also no risk appetite to give them that funding. So they need to bootstrap constantly. Whereas for the idea stage, remain in idea stage. So there's a gap in funding. So that's very important. The observation number 2 was Namibia has a vibrant support ecosystem with a high ratio of ESOs. That basically is entrepreneurial support organizations mapped to businesses. So what this basically means, we have more ESOs than we have actual investable startups in the ecosystem. And that proves to where the money is coming from. Another observation is the funding landscape. There's a lack of commercial funding in Namibia. So we talk about commercial funding and soft funding. So if you are in the ecosystem of innovation, you'll tend to see a lot of pitch competitions. There's a 5,000 here for an entrepreneur, a 10,000 here as a second prize, and a 50,000. That won't help them to be able to build the prototype of this level. So what we see is a lot of soft capital, but that commercial capital to do the R&D, to do the prototyping, to do the piloting, there is no money to carry them, and there is no house to house them. So in comparison to other countries, what we saw is Egypt, Kenya, Mauritius, Nigeria, Rwanda, and South Africa. Look at the ratio difference. For soft funding, 79% versus, let's say, an Egypt which gets 87% of commercial funding to the innovation ecosystem. And that basically comes back to who are the top 4 in Africa when it comes to that ecosystem. It's Egypt, it's Kenya, it's Nigeria, and it's South Africa. And Mauritius is competing very strongly these days. So recommendations were made, and I can happily say that we've ticked some of these boxes. Clearly defined startups and MSMEs, that came through the National Informal Economy Entrepreneurship Startup Policy, NISET policy, yes. My colleague is laughing at me. I got it. I butchered that one. So I think it's the National Informal Entrepreneurship Development Policy. Yes. So now we have a clear definition of what startups are in that policy. Under coordination, there's a recommendation to designate a national body to coordinate efforts. And we can proudly say that as NIPDB, we've spearheaded Scale Up Namibia, which is basically to bring all of these players together so that we can avoid the duplication of efforts. Navigation is to develop a guide on navigating the ecosystem. We also, in the pipeline, we have a website or a web page where we try and share information in a more coordinated method. And then obviously some things that are still outstanding is the skills, the foreign talent, market access and exports, lack of funding, and funding continuum. So these are still important things that we can collaborate to work towards. The Namibia we want and aspire towards. So in 2021, I was fortunate enough to be part of the 4IR team. And I think it comes back to my earlier conversation to say we have all of these national documents, we have all of these policies in place, but we never see them come to life. There were some incredible recommendations, and this was one of the most vibrant task forces that I've ever seen in country. I may be biased because I was part of it, and maybe because it was led by the Professor Anisha Peters. So I'm just making some of a, I'm just yeah, reminiscing. But anyway, so there were some recommendations, and I took from those recommendations. And it's also just to hold ourselves accountable. This is something that we wanted as a Namibia, was to develop a 4R human capacity and education reform. And education reform. Recommendation 4 was establish a national data center. Recommendation 7 was to develop a framework for the future of work. Recommendation 9 is to mobilize financial resources for 4IR development. Recommendation 12, strengthen research and development capabilities for 4IR. Recommendation 13 was to establish a national AI institute. What I'm trying to point out here is that we do not need any more policies. We don't need any more national documents. What we now need is action. The frameworks are in place. We need collaborators to make these things happen. So that's the Namibia we want. Future-proof. So AI and emerging technologies are transforming the pillars of society. We see it every day. For Namibia to become future-fit, it must be technology ready, not technology cautious. We need to embrace this. So globally and continentally, it is already reshaping education through personalized learning, smart tutoring, and we see that in Namibia as well. We have a startup called Yeni AI, and he's leveraging technology very well in the edutech space. Healthcare, our Honorable Minister is very adamant with our AI and the ambulances, and I think we need to support those ideas. And sometimes we need to rally about these futuristic things and also challenge ourselves. Healthcare, diagnostic tools, remote monitoring, telemedicine. We see it in logistics, smart routing, fleet tracking, warehouse automation. And as I mentioned these things, if you just dissect one of these value chains, we can already see the potential of what we can be in Namibia. And in agriculture, for instance, if we just focus on agriculture and we dissect that value chain to the core and we specialize as Namibia, what can we not be? The governance is very important. Citizen services automation is very important. I saw Mr. Yuan from OPM. I think this is very relevant. It keeps on being relevant. Data-driven policy making is also important. So if we want to be futuristic and if we want to be part of the future of this globalized world, it is important that our data is no more just on paper, that we need to transition. And if we don't have the data, where do we start? A very more important thing is also to have future-fit leadership. And that's why I say it's important to rally behind transformational leadership thinking. We need to move away from transactional leadership mentality, which is very much authority-centric, focus on short-term goals, centralized control, passive governance, rigid top-down communication, risk avoidance, to a leadership that thinks of purpose and values-driven, long horizons and systems thinking, ecosystem-based collaboration like we are seeing in this room, proactive and learning culture, adaptive, agile, inclusive teams, dialogue constantly, feedback and co-creation, and last, to be innovation with responsibility and experimentation. What this means for Namibia is we need leaders. Leaders must be systems thinkers, linking emerging sectors, youth, tech, and investment. What do we mean with systems thinking? Things don't work in isolation. The more we come closer together, the more we start brainstorming, we start seeing how these things are interlinked and we can't be working in isolation. Institutions must become learning organizations, adaptive, digital, and purpose-led. Public and private sectors, like SALT has done today, must collaborate across various ecosystems constantly. It must become our norm. Key aspirations that I foresee: a prosperous Namibia anchored in inclusive growth, sustainability, and shared national progress. A connected and collaborative Namibia, embracing regional integration and Pan-African solidarity. A people-driven Namibia powered by potential and participation of all its citizens. a resilient, united, and future-ready Namibia with a strong voice on the global stage. We can be the global players, and we can stand out amongst our peers constantly. So I'm going to close off with Her Excellency Dr. Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah Triple N's words, which is, as citizens of Namibia, we can write the next chapter of our common destiny when we accept that it should not be business as usual. Thank you.